Good day, everyone. The structure is, as Shelley said, going to be much the same as you've become used to. However, we're going to spend a little more time in led silence than perhaps we've had in the past. I'm also going to ask you in the middle for a quick IT experiment, but I'll explain that at the time. And we shall be using the prayer on page 97 of our book, if that's of interest to you. The one at the bottom. So we'll begin with time to gather ourselves. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, letting you know of my experiences of reading chapter 5 this week. I shall suggest a way for you to use your time in the breakout rooms in groups of 3 or 4. And we shall prepare for our time in groups with a further bit of silence. On return, I invite you all to consider sharing how the small group has touched you. And we're going to finish with a couple of ideas about how to use the remainder of the book in the last days of Lent. And as usual, we'll finish with prayer. So at this time, may I ask you specifically to gather your memories over the last few days of reading the chapter? Or if you didn't manage to read the chapter, what's been your actual experience of longing for God? Because today's theme is longing for God, the wound of longing. So what is your memory of reading the book this week? Did God prompt you this week? And if so, what kind of ground did his seed fall on? Let us pray. Into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart, for I love you, Lord, and so need to give myself, to surrender myself into your hands without reserve and with boundless confidence, for you are my Father. The best bread we can bring into this hour is that which Jesus has already handed to us. So I ask you to hold on to what God may have prompted you from the book this week. In one of our earlier sessions, Elaine happened to say that she found the longing the hardest of the three, contrition, compassion, and longing. Like me, I thought at the time. She said that often we long for what God can give us rather than rise to longing for him. Rebecca said that longing is often thought about longing for something, the destination. She said, don't think of it like that, but the longing itself is enough. It's about the journey, not the destination. Edwin said that longing was the driver of the other two and therefore important in that regard. Richard, I think it was, I'm sorry I didn't write it down, Richard, I think it was, who highlighted the great commandment, encapsulating the 3 windows: love the Lord your God, longing, and love your neighbours, compassion, as yourself, contrition. And I found that very helpful throughout my reading this Lent. So thank you all of you for what you've mentioned about longing so far. Elizabeth Ruth went about the subject like this. She began with biblical foundations from the Psalms and mostly from the Old Testament. She invited us to consider embracing our longings, She picks out 3 famous mystics and gives examples of their longing from within their, dare one say, slightly rarefied spiritual practice. I find, though I sometimes recognize and aspire to the spiritual experiences of the greats, I have to admit that I kind of look across at them as something not being able to do much more than appreciate as slightly exotic and kind of a foreign interest a little bit. But she widens it to perhaps the more local territory and refers to the callings of philosophers or artists or scientists as people who rightly pursue their longings that God has given them. She then mentioned longing and the image of the holy face of Jesus. In Julian's writing, this is the key reference because it's the prime reference within a showing number 2. By which I mean, if you go through Kindle and pick out her use of the term throughout, the first uses are where she describes her childhood requests. Let me read them again for you. And then in showing 2, she actually refers to it. So just to remind you of her request as a younger woman. I conceived a strong desire, writes Julian, to receive 3 wounds in my life. That is to say, the wound of true contrition, the wound of kind compassion, and the wound of purposeful longing for God. Just as I asked for the other 2 with a condition, and so I asked for this 3rd one urgently and without any condition. This 3rd request remained with me continually, says Julian. This was the section of the book that I found hardest to relate to on the surface. I continue personally to find it difficult to see how Julian draws such sweet, lovely insights from the actual images that she saw in her showings. This one about the 2 sides of the face of Jesus in his passion doesn't speak to me like it speaks to her. Then there's the context of Veronica's veil and also the poignant story of Thérèse of Lisieux's father's mental ill health. I didn't know about that, and her own and the brilliant conclusions that she drew from that experience. Elizabeth Ruth writes, to long is to pray and to seek, not now, but continuously. She then speaks of longing and gratitude. This is the one that really struck me most in my reading, and this is the one that I shall expand upon in my short talk. Next, she talks about longing and learning. I like this one, and I wouldn't have thought of it. Our study is best when it has longing lodged within it. Then she talked about longing and living under a rule. Yeah, I'm convinced of the importance of this one. Each of us should have an expectation of a personal calling that's for us as an individual. And in my experience, this has meant for me a lifetime's shifting and shuffling to get my path on my calling. Peter, Timothy, Paul all talk about it. Peter says, God who called us to his own glory and excellence. Peter says, God has called us to a holy life, not because of anything we've done, but because of his own purpose. Paul says, only let each person lead the life that God has assigned to them and to which he's called to them. Yet we each have a singular calling, and there's a beautiful place where our deepest longings as individuals and God's purposes for us, individually created, align and come together to his and to our deepest satisfaction. Then this chapter finishes with the 3rd window, a reminder of all 3 windows. The first window connected to contrition, remember, was the one that connected out to nature and physical necessity. The second window was one through which she ministered to the needs of others, compassion, as she gave her advice and her time. And the third, Elizabeth Ruth writes, looks out upon the sanctuary of the church, and through which Julian receives communion several times a year on the great feast days. This is obviously the window of our connection with God. Although the narrowest of all, it yet opens out onto the widest horizon. Throughout Lent, I've been conjuring with the question, why wounds? Couldn't we have had an equally good Lent book with just, Lord, give me contrition, give me compassion, give me longing? What does wounds add to our thinking about these concepts? Why did the young girl ask for wounds? I feel it's a great credit to Julian that the sentiments and desires of the young girl that would have rung alarm bells to any parish priest or spiritual director, frankly, turned out so well. Purposeful longing, she asked for. Her own word is actually willful longing in the original. Still longing not just for the experience of the heart, but for some end and for some purpose. What prompted that young girl to ask for the wounds? By his wounds we are healed, she would have known. Was it simply that she wanted to be like Jesus in every possible way? Wounds associated with the blood of healing and also of cleansing? Was it a recognition of a wound revealing the lifeblood? I suspect Julian was a serious little girl, and wounds are serious. I'm a magistrate, and in the English and Welsh courts, there's a big difference between assault and ABH, actual bodily harm. The wounding with blood is in a league of its own in our judicial system. 30 years later, having had the showings, the contemplation of wounds must have followed directly from her actual visions, full of the wounded head and body of Jesus and the blood that flowed copiously from it. Elizabeth Ruth perhaps takes a pinch of poetic license when she asks us to consider the possibility of the three windows replicating the three wounds, orifices to the world, she calls them. For sure, wounds expose us and reveal us. And for me, one of the key things that wounds constantly do is remind us. How many times have we damaged our fourth toe or a little bit of our little finger and been amazed at how much we use our fourth toe and that little bit of our little finger without realizing it? My personal challenge as a Christian is keeping mindful. In my 15 hours of wakefulness each day, how many minutes, I don't even like to ask the question, how many minutes are with God in my purview? And how much do I let my computer screen or my journey to walk or the supermarket shelves push him aside? Like a child trying to get your attention, wounds are irrepressible. They keep reminding you. But the wound of a longing then. I said earlier that it was longing and gratitude that jumped out to me this week. And so it's that I'd like to turn to now. Old age, if I may say for me, is creeping on. Creeping only at this stage, but I'm finding repeated lovely moments of gratitude for life arising out of the aging process. I want to make the case to you here that Julian may have known something of the wounds of aging being effectively wounds of longing. Let me start with Julian to make my case. She asked for these wounds, as she says, in my young days. I've read that her first experience of the plague in her local community would have been when she was 7. I have a gorgeous, sensitive 7-year-old granddaughter. We've been hearing a lot on the radio about the mental health consequences of our response to the COVID pandemic. Julian may have been a serious little girl, and we may not have to stretch our imagination to wonder why. If we accept that being 25 years old is still being a young woman, during Julian's younger days, a complete and utter catastrophe happened in Norwich. Let me read to you a little bit. Recent estimates indicate that out of a population which may have been as high as 25,000, as few as 6,000 survived in 1348. Either only 6,000 survived or were still living in the city 20 years later. 2/3 of the clergy had died. Only 1 in 3 market stalls were occupied the following year in the marketplace. The dead were piled high in carts and buried in communal pits in the Cathedral Close. Others were buried in the nearby St. George's Tombland churchyard, and it is said that the graveyards there had to be raised to cram in the bodies. In Lynn, almost half of the population died in 1349. Yarmouth was devastated in its crowded Rose area, ROWS. 2/3 of the population perished. And construction of the town's walls stalled for lack of workers. Economic life ground to a standstill, and work abruptly stopped in Norwich Cathedral's cloisters on June the 25th, 1349, a year later, according to the records, and didn't start again until 1355. Julian knew about death, and I'm sure it affected her writing and her thinking. Indeed, of course, Julian's showings came during a very near-death experience. I think we know the story well enough, it doesn't need to be repeated. But surely Julian's insights come directly from having her nose pushed right up against the pains of death. Then there's Julian and the death of children. Again, may I quote a textbook? The life expectancy at birth amongst 13th century nobles. It's a century out, but the 14th century statistics are so messed around by the Black Death, you can't use them. The life expectancy in the 13th century for a noble is to live to 30 years old. But having survived to the age of 21, a male member of the English aristocracy in the period could expect to live to 64. That's a bit later than I thought, actually. But it is an illustration of the profound toll on the lives of babies and children that, frankly, I think we can scarcely imagine. For me, I recoil from the feeling of an infant's death in my family with more horror than an adult's. And yet it abounded in Julian's own experience as a child and as a young girl and as an adult. And finally, Julian as a writer. We know her age, sorry, we don't know her age where she finished looking over her long text for the last time. But everyone I've heard on this believes that she may well have thought about it for a good many years after her visions when she was 30. Her life expectancy was less than ours. If she were a noble woman, she could have expected to live to 64 if the Black Death didn't get her. We don't have any indication that she was a noble woman, and even today, I don't know whether you know this, but it is true that the lowest socioeconomic groups in England live 9.7 years shorter than the highest socioeconomic sections of Great Britain this year, nearly a decade. So I venture that Julian, as a writer, finishing her work, was experiencing the aging process in a way not too dissimilar to some of us on this Zoom call. The 7-year-old with death all around her and the first visitation of the plague, the 25-year-old with that disaster, the 30-year-old's near-death experience with her visions, and the writer of Revelation contemplating her own mortality. So, tutored by Elizabeth, Ruth, and Julian, what do I find that is as a connection between this and the gift of longing, or the wound of longing? Sorry, the wound of longing. I find that I can talk a little bit about the wounds of aging, only a little. I notice getting tired when I used not to. When I struggle up the hill with my knee hurting on my bicycle, I mourn what's probably going to be the end of my cycling time at some point. When my Anna suffers an age-related illness, I have to judge as best as I can how to adjust to and help her to adjust to the constraints that will now last the rest of her life. We wake with creaking bones, sometimes simply after an afternoon's gardening. What else do I find, though? I find that I have a greater gratitude for life than I was ever capable of in my younger days. In the tuk-tuk on my way to Mumbai airport at the end of my holiday, I wondered whether I was ever going to smell those Indian drain smells again, and I feel nostalgically grateful for my rich life. When I use my mother's teaspoon and remember my first memory of its use, I feel sorry for the young things who haven't got my added gratitude as I stir my coffee. I note my exhaustion when the grandchildren are taken home, and I thank God for the blessings of seeing my children's children. When I come out of a period of silent sitting, I'm grateful that I've lived long enough to witness God's inner stillness. It didn't occur to me until I was in my 50s. When I sit at my neighbour's deathbed, I believe her when she advised me that old age isn't bad, it's just different. I profoundly do not believe that there is a design fault in God's creation that sort of reveals itself in our 60s, because I'm finding so far my life fuller and fuller of a longing, I'm not quite sure for what, but for life in all its fullness, life beneath the surface, more experience of life in the not yet kingdom of God. Like wine, it's quite hard to describe exactly what it tastes like. It's got a nostalgic quality to it, but it's looking forward as much as back. And its deepest notes for me are ones of gratitude and longing for the fulfillment of the kingdom. May I ask you all for a moment, just 6 or 7 seconds, to think of a picture of a valley in the sunshine. I can't remotely say that I think I'm in the shadow of death. In India, we knew all too much about the difference about being in the shade or not in the shade. But something different from 5 years or so ago has happened to me. And I'm in a new phase of some sort. And I think the valley of the shadow of death is a great picture. You can be on the lip of the valley or deeper down the side. It can be before noon in your picture of the valley, or it can be mid-afternoon. The shadows can be scarcely noticeable or really lovely and long. I am persuaded that as God delivers the wounds of aging in our lives, he is giving his even Christians dozens of gentle reminders a week of what we shall fully know in heaven. God of your goodness, give me just yourself, for thou art enough for me. Before we share with each other our thoughts about the wound of longing in our breakout rooms, may we have a little quiet. Let us pray. Let only your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all the love of my heart, for I love you, Lord, and so need to give myself, to surrender myself into your hands, without reserve and with boundless confidence, for you are my Father.